brother, Sam, who was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome at a young age. He's one of my best friends. We like to play basketball together. He's studying psychology here at BYU currently. He's actually in the audience today. Thanks for coming, Sam. And then this is my sister, Annie. She's 11 years old. She's a cutie. She was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome as well at a young age, and she is a bundle of joy. She's a track star. She won the 100-meter dash and long jump a couple days ago in her 6th grade track meet, and I'm so proud of her. Today I'll be talking about the physical, societal, and emotional barriers for children with Tourette syndrome in the United States. So, what is Tourette syndrome? Tourette syndrome is a neurological disorder that is characterized by involuntary movements or sounds, and these involuntary movements or sounds are called tics. As for the prevalence, about 300,000 children in the United States have Tourette syndrome. And for reference, that's about 2 times as many people as are in Salt Lake City. So there's a lot of people with Tourette syndrome in the United States, and specifically in the children's subset. So let's talk about tics though. What are tics? What is the symptomology of Tourette syndrome? For this, I would like you to take a second and imagine yourself in a high school classroom. High school classrooms are a little bit uncomfortable anyway, because maybe someone smells a little bit, or it's a little bit uncomfortable, or whatever it is, you're taking a math test and no one understands math anyway. But now imagine that you have Tourette syndrome and that you have to tic. Example 1, you need to clear your throat and jerk your head. And this is an impulse that your brain's sending to your body to do. Or example 2 is a subset of Tourette syndrome called coprolalia, where you need to shout an inappropriate phrase that you recently heard on TikTok. So what do? Well, sorry about that. You can't just not tic. As Patrick O'Leary said, who's a child with Tourette syndrome, telling me to just stop twitching makes as much sense as telling a person without legs to stand up. So here you are, stuck between an impossible decision of do I tic and potentially face embarrassment and shame, and I'm already uncomfortable because I'm a teenager, or wait, that's actually the only decision you can make because it's impossible not to tic. So with this, not only do children with Tourette syndrome have difficulties in understanding that side of social situations, they also often have comorbidities. And a comorbidity is when you have a medical diagnosis that is primary, like Tourette syndrome, and you have a secondary diagnosis, like OCD, that compounds the first diagnosis. So 90% of children with Tourette syndrome have some type of comorbidity. This could be OCD, ADHD, a sleeping disorder, anything along the lines of that. And to give an example of how this affects a child's tics, here's a perfect example right here. First, you may have to spin in a circle 15 times. This is the tic from the Tourette syndrome. If you have OCD, if you don't spin in a circle 15 times, not only is it feel uncomfortable, something's going to happen to your family. And although that isn't a very logical conclusion to make, due to the comorbidity, this causes a lot of stress on children with Tourette syndrome, and a lot of, in an already stressful world, a lot of damage mentally. To discuss the awareness and the understanding of Tourette syndrome in the general public, here I have 2 graphs. The first on this left-hand side is the prevalence of 3 common diseases: Tourette syndrome, Parkinson's, and epilepsy. As you can see here, Tourette syndrome actually is the most prevalent out of the 30, with the most diagnoses among children within the United States, or senior members or senior adults for Parkinson's. But contrasting that, Tourette syndrome is actually the least discussed and least aware for people in the general public. So why does this thing matter? Well, first off, 50% of children with Tourette syndrome are undiagnosed. And this is because children or teachers or parents or physicians don't actually understand what Tourette's looks like. On the social side of things, this often leads to some negative consequences. The first is that children and teenagers, when they're not aware of what's going on around them or they haven't been educated on a topic, often struggle with empathy. And this is manifested in the fact that 70% of children with Tourette syndrome experience bullying. This is 50% more than the average school-age child. And it doesn't just stop there. This was a statistic I came across in my recent research that was really hit home for me, is that children with Tourette syndrome are 400% more likely to die by suicide than the average child. So this lack of awareness compounds itself to the point of bullying, self-harm, and potentially suicide at a much higher increased rate than for the average child. So why does awareness matter? What can we do? Why am I up here presenting to you? This proposition is twofold. The first is on the diagnostic side, that as we have an increased awareness for physicians, for parents, for children, there are more children correctly diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. And this is wonderful because, as we'll get into in a minute, diagnosis for a child leads to effective treatment, which can actually help children with Tourette syndrome have a quality life. The second side of things is a social proposition. is there is a decreased level of bullying when kids are educated and understand what's going on with their peers. And that decreased bullying leads to decreased social isolation and increased peer acceptance and more friendship for kids with Tourette syndrome. In a joint study, it was found that effective therapeutic treatment after a correct diagnosis reduced tic severity by 53%. And as well, medication the doors open to medication after a diagnosis has occurred, and the quality of life improved for 60% of users with Tourette syndrome by decreasing their tic severity and quantity. So we can see here that a correct diagnosis doesn't just label an action or a type or a disorder, but it actually allows children with Tourette syndrome to increase their quality of life. As well, a general study about peer education in regards to bullying, after teenagers received a curriculum or a presentation regarding why they shouldn't bully, researchers observed a 30% drop in bullying. And to make this a more specific Tourette side of things, is that after a 2007 study where children in elementary school were educated on what Tourette syndrome is and how to help children that have Tourette syndrome feel welcomed, they found 3 significant outcomes. The first is that these children internalized the education. There was an increased knowledge of Tourette syndrome. And then they acted. They had better attitudes towards kids with disabilities and better attitudes towards kids with Tourette syndrome, and they had a deeper understanding of how to befriend kids and how to work from there. So to summarize, why does increased awareness matter? The first is that increased awareness leads to correct diagnosis and access to treatment and medication. And secondly, it decreases the social stigmas revolving around Tourette syndrome, and it increases the acceptance that kids feel that have Tourette syndrome. So what can you do? First and only major thing that I'd love for you to do is to share what you've learned with a friend. I find that often as I'm advocating for Tourette syndrome, as my brother has discussed his experiences, that just having an understanding ear and a smile is often what makes the most difference. And second, if you have questions, the Tourette Association of America does a great job of outlining what Tourette syndrome is and how you can help and how you can get involved. And in conclusion, children with Tourette syndrome don't need fixing. It's our understanding that does. The tics are involuntary, but our ignorance isn't. Thank you.
Guys, there were some fire lines in the presentation. Well done. Really good job. Here's the QR code. Go ahead and throw in your questions. Take a peek here and see what we got. This is a great question. Matt, you ready?
Let's go.
Is there a window for diagnosis for children where we would see the most improved outcomes for Tourette syndrome?
Yeah, so typically children with Tourette syndrome are normally diagnosed in the early years of their life from 5 to 12. And if you're able to diagnose them before they hit puberty, that's huge. As everyone knows, that any child hitting puberty is about to go through a wall of emotions and hormones. But especially when they have tics that get upregulated once they hit puberty, if you can diagnose them, understand, and give them interventions or help them understand what's going to be going on in their life, it's a great 5 to 12. It's a great radius, a great time period.
Great response. Thank you guys.